Hey everyone, it's Andrew Embler, CTO of Concrete5, and today I'd like to introduce you to the Concrete5 REST API. Since its creation, Concrete5 has been a CMS that makes it easy to put data into it and display that data on a website, or work with it programmatically in some way. But the website that you edit in Concrete5 is tightly coupled to that data, and it's not simple or standardized to get data out of Concrete5 in real time and display it on another website or in a JavaScript application. You can always write your own custom code to do this, but making sure that custom code is secure to industry standards and keeps up with Concrete5 development is no small task. Happily, I'm here to report that as of version 8.5, Concrete5 has the beginnings of a REST API built into the core, with support for OAuth 2 for authentication and OpenID Connect for identity verification. These are industry standards. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can enable Concrete5's API in version 8.5.2 and query it using Postman, a popular cross-platform API client. First, it's important you're on the right version of Concrete5. You'll notice I said 8.5.2. This video is working on the latest developed branch as of May 2019. That's going to be 8.5.2. That version should be available in a week or so as of this video. You want to be using that version because we've added some functionality to the API in recent pull requests that we might be talking about today. First, let's fire up Postman and make an API request. My local site is running at concrete5.test, but you can substitute the URL that I'm going to put in here to that site for any live Concrete5 site. Here's my example REST API query. All Concrete5 REST API queries start with CCM API v1. This is because we don't want any of our REST API routes to conflict with routes or pages that you may have created on your site. This is the system information query. It returns a JSON object of data about your site that you would see if you went to the system information dashboard page. We like to use this query for tests like these because it's simple and it doesn't require any parameters. And it makes it easy to tell whether the API is working. So we send that request. You'll notice I get HTML back, and a quick perusal of this page shows that this is a page not found page. There it is. That's because I have not enabled my REST API yet. This is important. By default, Concrete5's API is not enabled. That's because many sites will not need this functionality, and we didn't want to ship with it enabled out of the box. Fortunately, enabling it is a simple process. Let's switch back into Chrome, go into System and Settings, scroll down here to API Settings, and click this Enable API checkbox. Now some new options show up. You'll see this grant type section. This is for OAuth 2. If you're not familiar with OAuth 2, I would encourage you to get familiar. You shouldn't need to know too much about it to make Concrete5's API work, but it has helped me wrap my head around it just reading some of those documentation. By default, we enable a couple grant types. That's because we want grant types are basically ways of authenticating into the system and getting authorization as a particular user or as a simple application. You shouldn't need to change these settings right here unless you really know what you're doing. Next, what you're going to need to do is not just enough to enable the API. What you're going to need out of the API, and this is probably old news to anyone who's worked with APIs before, but you're going to need a client ID and a client secret. These are long random identifiers that are generated for you by the application that you're going to interact with over the API. And that's because we want to give the application the ability to revoke access at any time. So what you're going to do is create an API integration. And this is typically, you would name this whatever you're doing. So if you're working on an external website and you're trying to display users on that for a baseball team or something like that, you might call this baseball roster or whatever. I'm going to call this Postman demo. Redirect is not something that you're going to really need to worry about most likely, but we have it here. And then add integration, and you'll notice we automatically create client ID and client secret. Now we store these encrypted in the database, so don't refresh your page without writing them down. Next, there's this user consent level. This is basically what it controls how the scopes of the API are displayed to users when they request them. You shouldn't really need to change these either. So let's copy these over here, just in case I lose them in my video, and head back to Postman. Now that we've turned the API on, let's refire that request. You'll notice we get something different now. This is promising, but it's still not giving us what we want. So now the endpoint is not returning with a not found, but it is returning with a 401 unauthorized. That's because although we are sending a valid API request and we have enabled the API, we aren't sending the client ID or the client secret that we need in order to actually authenticate and authorize this request. What that basically means is that we need to ask for permission to the system using that ID and request and give the system uh, a list of all the things we want to do, which are OAuth 2 scopes. Fortunately, Postman makes it easy to do this. In whatever client code you're going to do, you're going to write, you're going to need to specify client ID and client secret in some way. This is pretty standard stuff in any REST API client libraries that you'll find. So in order to send over the client ID and the client secret that we got from Concrete5, go into the authorization tab. We are using OAuth 2, and you'll notice that well, I have an access token here because I've been testing this, but typically you would not. And so let's get a new access token. OAuth 2 basically gives you access tokens when you give it client ID and client secrets, and then you pass that access token encrypted back over the request instead of passing the ID and the secret every time. So let's get an access token. What we're going to do, we're going to give this a name. That's just for Postman's benefit. System info token. We're going to use the simplest grant type. These will probably be familiar from the API settings dashboard page. If you do not enable the client credentials grant type, this will not work. This is the Concrete5 access token URL. We have a couple access token endpoints. We'll document those as we continue in the API settings section of the developer documentation. And here is where we pass in our client ID and our client secret. So these are the values that we generated in the dashboard page. Next, we have to tell the API what scopes we want. Eventually, Concrete5 will be able to limit those scopes at the integration level, making it possible to say this client ID integration can only do the system info call. Right now, we don't have that functionality. So a list of scopes is available in the API section of the developer documentation as well. But for this one, it is system info read. That's the only one we need. What that means is the access token that we get will only be able to read system information. And this information is typically presented to the user in certain flows so that the user can determine whether the application that is getting access is trying to do too much. So now let's request a new token. We got one back, so let's use that token in our request. So now let's close that back up and resend. And there we have it. Instead of getting an access denied, we are getting all the data about our Concrete5 site. This is just a simple JSON object that you can use your client libraries to parse. Let's do something a little bit more advanced. You'll notice this request, we sent the client ID and the client secret, but we did not need to log in as a user. That's because with Concrete5, there are certain API requests that require you to know about a particular user, and there are certain ones that do not. The system info call that we are doing right now is not wrapped in any kind of permissions check. So if you have a valid client ID and a valid client secret, you can run this call. However, there are some API requests that do require you to be logged in and or if they don't require you to be logged in, they use the Concrete5 permissions. So making requests to them with just the client ID and the client secret, those requests won't know who you are, you'll be unregistered, and you won't get any data back. Let's show an example of that. Here, I'm going to get information about a file. This is just a simple get route, file 1, the first file in the system. Let's try and send a request for this. First, you'll notice I get an error because I'm out of scope. That's because this access token only has access to the system info read scope. So let's get a new access token. Same client credentials, the files read scope. And here we're getting an error. So we now no longer get the scope error, but unfortunately, since we're not using a logged in authenticated request, we can't get information about this file. That's because currently in the files read API, we use the permission as to whether a user can view the file in the file manager, which is an administrator level permission. You can set that to whatever you want in Concrete5, and the API honors it. So you can know that by turning on the Concrete5 API, you're not just giving full, complete, unfettered access to people just if they authorize with the proper scopes. Permissions are still respected. So what we need to do is we need to tell the application that we are a particular user along with the client ID and the client secret. And the way to do that is the OAuth2 authorization flow. So you'll notice we're going to need to get a new access token, and we want to change this to authorization code instead. And you'll see that I've already got my URLs in here. These are the two OAuth2 URLs that Concrete5 enables with the API, an authorize URL and a token URL. I'm still going to send a files read request, but I'm going to authorize along with my client ID and my client secret. And you'll notice Postman is very smart and pops open a web browser window in order to do this. That's because the authorize URL presents this state to the user. And if I log in as admin, you'll see that the Postman demo is requesting to read detailed information about the uploaded files. That's because I passed files read as my scope. If I wanted to do more than that, I'd see more permissions listed out here. So you can determine whether this makes sense to you and whether you want to authorize that. I do because I'm doing the demo right now. Now we have a new access token that is using the authorize code grant. And if we go back here, close this up and refresh, ta-da, we have information about the file. That's because the admin user can view information about the files in the file manager. So what we have here is we have two requests, one system info that is not authenticated, does not require anything beyond a valid client ID, client secret, and access token. And then we have a files request that does require a logged in user, does use Concrete5 permissions to make sure that you have access to do what you're asking to do. And that is a quick introduction to the Concrete5 REST API. We don't have too many other routes than the one that you see here. There are a couple more internal ones that we've needed that we've added, but the sky's the limit. We really want to start getting pull requests into the core for adding more REST API routes. The syntax for doing that is relatively straightforward. I'm going to be posting more docs soon about how to define those REST API routes and secure them. And the examples of those in action are pretty straightforward. So we're really hoping to get some community help with building out this REST API. And be on the lookout for more information about connecting to these libraries. I've got some more videos in the works about showing how easy it is to connect to this API using from other PHP applications. Obviously, Postman is a useful demo, but this is just a sort of proof of concept showing how to enable the API and how to query it. But it will be valuable to have some videos detailing how we can actually connect to the API from real code, whether it's JavaScript or another language or another PHP application. So be on the lookout for those. And as always, please feel free to ask questions of us in Slack and on the concrete5.org forums. And thank you for tuning in today.